Well, that jukebox cries the blues like it knows what I'm about. And since my woman left, I'm down and out.
George Strait, the king of country music. He has 44 country Billboard #1 hits. More Billboard #1 hits than any artist of any genre ever. Now, if you count all the country charts that have ever seen a George Strait song at #1, that would give George more than 60 #1 hits. He has had #1 hits in 4 different decades, his last #1 coming in 2008 with the song River of Love. But what were George Strait's first #1 hits? Now we know we're going to have to go back a while, back into the 1980s. So let's go back a bit in history and take a look at the first songs that started George Strait's illustrious, unmatchable career. Now, if you want to learn more about George Strait's life before he became famous, I have a video on that and more in the George Strait playlist, which I'll link to in the video description below. So be sure to check that out. But let's go look at some of George Strait's music. Let me surprise you a little bit with this one. Here's the first recording of George made in 1976 on a song called I Just Can't Go On Dying Like This.
Or is that just exactly what I'm not supposed to do? I'll just stop in here, have a glass of beer. I'm just a fool, I guess, but I just can't go on dying like this.
Now, of course, this wasn't one of his #1 hits. This was before anyone knew who George Strait was. This song was recorded in Houston, Texas. And then he recorded another song called That Don't Change the Way I Feel About You in 1978. And here's that song.
I've tried to keep you satisfied. I give about all I can give. But that don't change the way I feel about you. Just the way that you feel about me.
Now, one night in 1980, George met a man who would take him to Nashville to record some demo songs. But the powers that be in Nashville thought George's songs sounded too country. So they said no. George continued to push his way into Nashville until MCA Records finally gave him a deal that went something like this. We'll release one of your songs. If it does well, we'll pay for your first album. If it doesn't, we're going to move on. So that's just what they did. In 1981, MCA Records released George Strait's first single called Unwound. Now, Unwound made it to #6, and keeping their end of the bargain, MCA worked with George to release his first album called Straight Country. But it wasn't until George's second album called Straight from the Heart, where George started owning the #1 spot on the country charts. Now, the song, his first #1, was written specifically for a movie called The Soldier. And George and the Ace in the Hole Band even made a brief appearance in that movie. The movie was quickly forgotten, but George's song was not. It was, of course, his first #1 hit. The name of the song, Fool-Hearted Memory.
Got a fool-hearted memory. Won't let him see that she walked out the door.
Now, 2 other singles were released from Straight from the Heart. They were both great songs, one called Marina Del Rey and the other Amarillo by Morning, which both made it to the top 10, but not into the #1 spot. But it was the last single released from his album, which gave George his second #1 hit in 1983 with this song called A Fire I Can't Put Out.
Candle burning up my mind. At least I'm happy knowing what love's all about. You'll always be a fire I can't put out.
Now, an interesting story about this song called A Fire I Can't Put Out was it was written by a man named Darrell Stetler, who had been writing country songs since the mid-1960s. Now, this George Strait song was one of the last songs he ever wrote before he quit writing songs professionally, and it was Daryl's first and only #1 song. And then came George Strait's third album, released in 1983, called Right or Wrong. And on this album, it was pretty clear that George had hit his stride. From this album came 4 singles, and all 4 went to #1. The first single off this album was You Look So Good in Love.
You look so good in love. You want him, it's easy to see. You look so good in love. I wish you still wanted me.
Now, there's a story behind the video of this song, and it goes something like this. George Strait hated the video. He thought it was corny and dumb, and he demanded they take it off the air immediately. He truly felt embarrassed by the video of this song. In fact, he hated this video so much that he refused to do videos for his songs for several years. But refusing to do music videos didn't hurt his singles on the radio at all, because the title track of the album, called Right or Wrong, went straight to the top of the charts.
Though I prayed that you'd be true in your heart, please just remember, right or wrong, I'm still in love with you. That's right.
So let me tell you something about Right or Wrong that I had no clue about until researching for this very video. Now, you might not believe this, but Right or Wrong was not written by George or any of the country hit writers in Nashville. In fact, when George recorded the song was already more than 60 years old. You see, Right or Wrong was a jazz ballad written back in 1921. It was a very popular tune back in the day and was recorded by many crooners and bands back then. In fact, here's a recording of the song back in 1929.
In your heart, please just remember, right or wrong, I'm still in love with
George
you.
Strait took Right or Wrong to the top of the country charts in 1983. And finally, George's 5th #1 single came in 1984 and was called Let's Fall to Pieces Together. Now, this song was originally offered to George Jones, but he turned it down. And so they offered the song to George Strait's producer, who had produced George's first 2 albums. Well, his producer then also declined the song. But on George's 3rd album, Right or Wrong, he had a different producer, and this producer liked the song and suggested it to George. George recorded the song, and of course it went to the top position, becoming George Strait's 5th #1 hit.
Let's fall to pieces together. Why should we both fall apart?
And those are the stories behind George Strait's first 5 #1 hits. Starting with his first #1 hit in 1982, George Strait already had 5 #1s to his name just 2 short years later in 1984. And of course, we know this was just the beginning of George Strait's illustrious career. Now, there are so many more songs and stories about George Strait, and I plan to make more videos about his career. A couple of ideas I have running around is a video on his most popular #1s, which will be actually pretty hard to figure out because he has so many. And while George is a rather personal man and keeps his life to himself, I've picked up a book written by a family friend that I'm also getting more George Strait stories from. And I hope to share those stories with you soon, but that's a story for another day.